This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's your new profession or just a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their awesome all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. In the entire history of the United States, there has only ever been one unelected president, a single man who neither won a presidential election nor was elected vice president. At the moment he reached the Oval Office, the only electorate Gerald Ford had ever faced were the voters of Michigan's 5th District. A 12-term representative and minority Speaker of the House, Ford seemed destined to go down in history as a mere footnote, a man who'd had a solid career before retiring to a life of golf and afternoon naps. In 1973, he even told his wife that he was ready to call time on his career. Instead, fate threw him a curveball that would change American history. That October, the abrupt resignation of Spiro Agnew left Richard Nixon desperate for a new vice president. Barely had he settled on Ford than Nixon himself was toppled by the Watergate scandal. Thrust into the White House, Ford took over a bitterly divided nation that was tearing at the seams. His attempts to fix it would have consequences to this very day. As a congressman, Gerald Ford was famous among his colleagues for his genial disposition, for never seeming to be fazed by anything. But there was one subject that caused Ford visible discomfort, one topic he would try to avoid for the rest of his life: his father. Born Leslie Lynch King Jr. in Omaha on the 14th of July 1913, Ford spent the first 2 miserable years of his life carrying his hated pa's name. Leslie King was a mean drunk who regularly beat Ford's mother Dorothy. When she finally fled his toxic grasp in 1915 for the safety of Grand Rapids, Michigan, the wealthy Leslie refused to send a penny in child support. Perhaps it's no wonder that Dorothy rechristened her little boy Jerry after her new husband, Gerald Rudolph Ford. A Midwesterner to his core, Gerald was a paint salesman who believed in virtues like hard work, patriotism, and loyalty. He also believed in family. In 1916, he officially adopted young Jerry, raising the boy as his own. He clearly made a big impression. As a teenager, Ford idolized his stepfather, tried to emulate him in every way. As soon as he was old enough, he legally changed his own name to Gerald Ford. But the similarities with his stepdad went beyond just his name. Like Gerald, Ford believed in loyalty to your kin. When the Great Depression threatened to kill his stepdad's business, Ford worked long hours waiting tables to help pay the bills. Much later, he'd say that the experience had taught him one essential truth: the harder you work, the luckier you are. I worked like hell. Yes, it would be while working that Ford suffered one of the nastiest shocks of his life. By now a strapping lad of 17, Ford was clearing tables one day when he saw a customer looking at him strangely. At first, the future president thought nothing of it, but then that customer stood up, came over, and said, "Leslie, I'm your father." That Star Wars moment was one of the few events that ever threw Ford off balance. He later told people he felt like this monster was trying to intrude on his happy family life to destroy the relationship it forged with his stepdad. After that meeting, he'd never speak to his biological father again. Still, such painful moments were rare in the life of Jerry Ford. By senior year, he was a star football player who'd be voted most popular in his class. Still, even at this tender age, he couldn't translate being well-liked into electoral success. That year, he ran for class president on the progressive ticket, and in a nice bit of foreshadowing, he lost. Not that this bothered Jerry at the time. Awarded a football scholarship to the University of Michigan, he excelled so well on the team that both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers dangled contracts before him. But Ford could never quite trust that his dream career might work out. Instead, he took a job coaching football at Yale, and after 3 years pestering the faculty, was allowed to enroll in law classes. The dual workload of training and studying was crushing, but if there's one thing Ford never lacked, it was work ethic. He graduated in January 1941 in the top third of his class. Back in Grand Rapids, he opened a law firm with an old friend and began to flirt with Republican politics. Like everyone in the community, Ford in 1941 was a staunch isolationist, one who felt that the United States should stay aloof from the cares of the world. But something was about to happen that would completely transform the young man's perspective, setting him on the path to Washington. Gerald Ford was about to go to war. On December 7th, 1941, America's isolationists found themselves catapulted into a terrifying new reality. Images of fire engulfing ships at Pearl Harbor dominated the newspapers. In the wake of the atrocity, Gerald Ford enlisted in the Navy. Because of his backgrounds, the Navy assigned him a post putting new recruits through a grueling fitness program. Screw that, Ford basically said. I want to go to fight. It took forever, but at last, after enough pestering, the Navy was like, fine, goddammit, you go to the Pacific. Assigned to the U.S.S. Monterey, Ford at last saw the action that he craved. Over the course of the war, he'd earned himself 10 battle stars. He'd also come within an inch of losing his life, not via a Japanese bullet, but by a typhoon that almost swept him overboard. By the time Ford at last returned to Grand Rapids in the fall of 1945, he was a changed man. The war had transformed him into an ardent internationalist, certain that America needed to take its place on the world stage. It had also turned his interest in Republican politics into an obsession. For the first 3 years after returning to Michigan, Ford lived a regular middle-class life, working in a law firm, making money playing golf. He even found time to woo Betty Ann Bloomer, a former dancer that he adored. Beneath this comfortable surface, though, something was awakening, an ambition Ford never knew he harbored. Ford wanted to get into politics. At the time, Michigan's reliably Republican 5th District was represented by an ardent isolationist. This bothered Ford, just as it bothered plenty of other young Republicans. Together, they decided to primary the incumbent. It was an audacious move, one Ford quietly told Betty that he thought would fail. Still, he brought his tireless work ethic to the task, canvassing all up and down the district, going door to door, talking to any voter who'd listen. It was a tactic that worked. Ford won his primary by 10,000 votes. In such a red-leaning district, that could only mean one thing. Gerald Ford was going to Washington. In fall 1948, Ford and Betty married. Just months later, the pair moved to D.C. and Ford entered the House for the first of 12 consecutive terms. Not that he'd get very far at first. Ford's political progress was less like someone riding a rocket ship to the top and more like a balloon lazily rising into the afternoon sky. For his first 2 terms, the new representative did almost nothing of note, aside from making friends with a promising young lawmaker from California named Richard Nixon. It was only in 1953, by which time his Californian friend had already risen to vice president, that Ford joined a subcommittee. For the next 8 years, Ford slowly built a reputation based on 3 things: fiscal conservatism, anti-communism, and a borderline insane loyalty towards Nixon. Even though he was only VP at this stage, Dick Nixon was already living up to his nickname, forging a reputation as an unstable, vindictive sociopath. Yet Ford defended his old buddy unconditionally, even if his buddy seemed to have more or less completely forgotten that he existed. One ungrateful dick aside, though, Ford was doing pretty well enough that he began to nurture a new dream: to become Speaker of the House. It was a hell of an ambition. Starting in 1954, the House saw a Democrat winning streak that would last clear until Bill freaking Clinton was in the Oval Office. Even before this, the House had only gone Republican twice since Herbert Hoover had been voted out. For a Republican like Ford, dreaming of becoming Speaker was a little bit like you or I dreaming of becoming America's next top model. Still, Ford tried his damnedest. Joining forces with a GOP faction that called themselves the Young Turks, he managed to topple the Republican old guard after the party's dismal 1964 election, becoming minority speaker. Now all he needed was one big Republican win in the House, and he'd fulfill his dream of holding the speaker's gavel. Sadly for Ford, that win would never come. But that didn't mean his career was destined to stall out as minority speaker. In just 9 years, he would go from historical also-ran to President of the United States. And hey, if you're looking for success beyond your wildest dreams in your next venture, whether it's running for office or just running a website, you've got to get a website done with Squarespace. Now more than ever, people are getting creative with their time. They're reaching into their pockets to start a new business or launch a new blog. The world really is yours, and Squarespace is the perfect web tool to help you fashion it into whatever you like. It's the platform to use when you're ready to get started on that next web project that you've been thinking about. Are you looking to get in and out quickly without thinking too much about what your website should look like? Bam! Use one of their quick and beautiful templates to make a website that's fresh and for you. Or maybe you're more of a hands-on person, you've got lots of opinions and ideas about exactly what the site should look like. Well, Squarespace gives you all of the customization options that you could ever want, with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Once you're done setting up your website, tinkering with the design if you're so inclined, there's so many extra features that Squarespace provides so that your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 support, so much stuff all in one place. So when you're ready to get started on that next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, it's got to be with Squarespace. Right now, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your site, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, and let's get back to Ford. So here it is at last, the crazy part, the part that would have seemed like fiction to Ford's colleagues back in 1964. The part where Ford becomes president not by running in an election or even by getting on the ticket as VP for a president doomed to die. No, Ford was destined to become president through sheer dumb luck. The 1970s dawned with Ford seemingly having passed his career high watermark. In 1968, he'd watched as House Republicans came within an inch of a majority, only to just fall short. Still, he'd returned to Congress full of hope. His old California buddy was now president, and he felt sure Nixon would work closely with him on passing legislation. In reality, Nixon's team thought Ford was a clown of the highest order. In private, they agreed with Lyndon Johnson's withering assessment that Jerry Ford is so dumb that he can't fart and chew gum at the same time. As Nixon was re-elected in 1972, Ford privately began to admit to Betty that he was getting worn out, that being minority leader wasn't cutting it anymore. He promised her he'd take just one more shot at the Speaker's gavel in the 1974 midterms, and if that failed, well, he would bow out of politics knowing that he'd tried his best. In the end, though, Ford would never compete in the midterms. That's because the biggest scandal of the 20th century was about to blow through Washington like a sleazy hurricane. Back in 1972, people connected to Nixon's campaign to re-elect the president, pleasingly abbreviated to CREEP, were caught burglarizing the Democratic National Committee's offices in the Watergate building. Days after the story broke, Ford sought out Nixon's advisors to ask if the president was involved. They told him no, presumably while crossing their fingers super hard behind their backs. Because Nixon was already up to his neck in Watergate, and it wasn't the only scandal rocking his administration. On the 10th of October 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew appeared in court to answer corruption charges. Before giving testimony, he resigned his post. That evening, Ford was at home, trying to unwind after a stressful day. Just as he was thinking about heading to bed, he got a call. A White House aide was on the other end. How, the aide asked, would Ford feel about becoming vice president? "I suspect if I was asked," Ford replied, characteristically calm, "I would accept it." Knowing what we do today, the phone call can seem inevitable, just one more step on the 38th president's path to office. But the reality is that it only happens due to a kaleidoscope of coincidences. The first of these is that Nixon needed a new vice president at all. Just a decade earlier, the US had been without a VP for over a year after Johnson took over from Kennedy. For ages, there had been no mechanism to actually replace a fallen VP. It had only been since 1967 that the 25th Amendment allowed presidents to nominate a new VP in emergencies, and Ford was the first person ever nominated in this way. The second factor was the lack of other candidates. Although Nixon had presented a list, he was told that none would be confirmed by the Democratic Congress. The genial Ford was just about the only Republican who would A, want the job, and B, survive the nomination process. Third, and finally, there was Watergate itself. There's evidence Nixon could see impeachment coming and wanted to make sure the alternative was even worse than letting him stay in office. By offering a choice between removing him from power and getting President can't fart and chew, or just allowing Nixon to stay on, Tricky Dick was banking on Congress choosing the devil they knew. On December 6, 1973, Gerald Ford became Vice President of the United States. He told Betty the post would be a nice conclusion to his career. In his first speech, he indicated he would simply serve out the rest of Agnew's term, then leave alongside Nixon in January of 1977. But that wasn't how history was going to roll. In less than a year, Nixon would be gone, and Ford would be making history.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Before VP Ford had even been confirmed, the wheels were coming off the Nixon administration. The Saturday Night Massacre on October 20th, 1973 saw Nixon fire the special prosecutor investigating Watergate, setting off the mother of all storms in D.C. By the summer of 1974, the Supreme Court was ordering him to turn over the tapes he'd recorded of private conversations related to the scandal. It was closing time on the Nixon presidency. Yet even now, Ford didn't seem to grasp the enormity of what was happening. As solid and reliable as ever, the new VP simply continued to defend his old friend, even as the red flags transformed into urgent semaphore screaming, "Do not trust this dude." It was only when the audio transcript showing Nixon's involvement in the Watergate cover-up was released that Ford finally heeded them. On August 6, 1974, Nixon called a cabinet meeting to declare that he'd never resign. It fell on Ford to look his old pal in the eye and tell him the cabinet could no longer defend him. By now, it's almost certain Ford had realized that he was going to be president. There was no way Nixon could remain in power until January 77. But even Ford didn't realize how soon Tricky Dick would be gone. On August the 8th, Nixon abruptly went on TV to announce his resignation, effective noon the next day. It was all the warning Ford got to prepare himself for the presidency. The very next day, Richard Nixon clambered into a helicopter and flew off into ignominy. As he vanished over the horizon, the accidental vice president took the oath of office and became the accidental president. Addressing the cameras, Ford, still looking like he couldn't quite believe what was happening, declared,
"My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule."
It was a nice sentiment, well expressed. In response, Ford's approval rating soared. It would be the only time America ever fully supported its new leader. 1 month later, on September the 8th, President Ford issued perhaps the most infamous pardon in U.S. history. Absolving Nixon of any crimes he may have committed, Ford intended to draw a line under Watergate to let the nation move on with the healing. Instead, he pressed the self-destruct button on his own presidency. In the media, Ford was accused of making a corrupt bargain with Nixon. He was called to testify before a House committee. His poll numbers cratered. It was the sharpest drop in public opinion since polling began. Less than a month into his first term, Gerald Ford had already torpedoed any chance he had at re-election. Remember Donald Trump once saying that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and still not lose any votes? Well, the opposite was now true for Ford. He could be caught on film running into a burning orphanage to save a basket of puppies, and America would still treat him like the guy who farted at a funeral. But while Ford was toast, there was still another 2 years until Americans could deliver their verdict at the ballot box. 2 years in which Ford would stumble on, wounded, hemorrhaging support, trying to make his mark in the face of a hostile Congress. As we're about to see, it was not going to be a pretty sight. The presidency Ford inherited was the ultimate poison chalice. Inflation and unemployment were soaring, oil prices were high, there were riots in big cities, NYC was about to go bust, and America was just months away from comprehensively losing the Vietnam War. But even given the mess Nixon left him, it'd be hard to say Gerry Ford rose to the challenge. Take the economic nightmare known as stagflation. In the fight against inflation and unemployment, Ford's advisors initially convinced him to tackle inflation. In fall of 1974, the White House printed 12 million badges bearing the acronym WIN for Whip Inflation Now, part of a drive to hike taxes and slash government spending. But barely had the first 100,000 badges been distributed than Ford discovered the U.S. was in recession and immediately pulled a massive U-turn by instead cutting taxes. The whiplash was jarring and became even more so when the Democrat-controlled Congress forced through government spending increases. But while the economy would eventually improve under Ford, it never really felt like it. In spring of 1975, for example, New York City went bust. Although the GOP's moderate wing urged Ford to bail out the nation's largest city, the fiscally conservative Ford just couldn't bring himself to do it. The result, the infamous newspaper headline, "Ford to City, dropped dead." Eventually, after months of wrangling, Ford did agree to release federal funds, but this was just as bad. Having alienated moderate Republicans before, now he severely pissed off the conservative wing by caving to public pressure. Then there was busing. Lost in the bombshell of Nixon's resignation had been the order of a Boston judge to use busing to desegregate the city's schools. This had led to riots. Black kids had been surrounded, spat on and called racial slurs. One white kid had been stabbed. Sadly, Ford once again found himself falling into the crack between his party's two wings. Having been to an integrated high school, Ford was all in favour, but as a small government conservative, he couldn't abide a judge forcing integration to happen. The result was a flip-flopping on the issue that again angered everyone, all while Boston burned. The tragedy of Ford's character is that what appeared to be indecisiveness actually came from a core set of beliefs deep within his soul. At heart, Ford was still a typical Midwesterner. He believed in hard work and neighborliness, in a decent world where people would choose to be decent of their own accord without the government needing to step in. These are not bad values to hold, but at a time when left and right were both diverging, they simply didn't match the mood. Maybe if Ford could have positioned himself firmly in either camp, he would have won another term. Maybe he could have succeeded as a Rockefeller moderate or a Reagan before Reagan. Alas, Ford couldn't be either of those things. In his first days in office, Ford had tried to reach across the aisle, offering the post of National Security Advisor to a conservative Democrat. If nothing else, it would have been interesting, a sign of a leader taking his party in a new direction. But Ford wasn't a natural leader. He wavered at the last second, then withdrew the offer, just as he wavered expelling members of Nixon's cabinet. There's a reason Gerry Ford only became president by accident, a reason he never desired the Oval Office. Perhaps deep down, he simply knew that he wouldn't be very good at it. Despite usually showing up in the lower half of presidential rankings, Gerald Ford's tenure wasn't a complete car crash. He wasn't corrupt, he didn't start a civil war or incite insurrection. Occasionally, he even managed to pull out a win. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 was an epic humiliation for the United States, one Ford couldn't have stopped. But he was able to shape the nation's response to that humiliation, and he managed to do so with a humanitarian touch. Championing a bill that allowed special status to those fleeing communist regimes in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Ford helped get 130,000 refugees quickly resettled in the USA. It was a gesture that won him no friends on his party's right, but it did send a very clear signal. Under Gerry Ford, America would no longer abandon those who'd helped her. A slightly more gung-ho PR win came a month later. After Khmer Rouge forces captured the U.S. vessel Mayaguez, Ford ordered a commando team to liberate the ship. Although 40 Americans died in the firefight, the vessel was secured. In the wake, Ford saw his poll numbers soar. Still, they weren't good enough to guarantee re-election. And now he had had a taste of the presidency, Ford no longer wanted to just step down in January 1977. So he set out on a cross-country tour to convince voters to give him a second term. Instead, it almost got him killed. Within the space of 17 days in September 1975, Ford narrowly survived 2 assassination attempts. The first was at the hands of a Manson cult member, Lynette Squeaky Fromme, who pointed a pistol at Ford but was tackled by the Secret Service. The second call was closer. A mentally unstable accountant, Sara Moore, managed to get off a shot at the president before a bystander disarmed her. Yet Ford managed to shake off these 2 near misses with comparative ease. Far harder to shake off was the electorate's image of him as a total buffoon. This was the early era of Saturday Night Live, when its sketches set the tone for the national conversation. Every week, Chevy Chase was playing Ford as a graceless klutz who blew his nose with his tie, fell over everything, and couldn't say a straight sentence. However unfair, it was an image of Ford that stuck in everyone's mind. So when a charismatic conservative former film star announced that he was going to run against the president in the Republican primaries, it was clear Ford was going to be fighting an uphill battle. Ronald Reagan's 1976 primary campaign was almost good enough to unseat the 38th president. In a sign of how the times were changing, his message resonated so much with the GOP's right that Ford barely scraped his party's nomination. But the real danger in 76 wasn't from the Reagan right, but from a one-term governor and former peanut farmer on the left. Jimmy Carter was a political novice with low name recognition, but post-Watergate, that outsider status helped him win voters' trust. As the man who'd pardoned Nixon, how could Ford ever compete? On the 2nd of November 1976, Gerald Ford faced the national electorate for the first time in his life. While he outperformed his polls, it wasn't enough to net him a second term. Gerald Ford departed the White House in January 1977, convinced this wasn't the end. Convinced he'd run again in 1980 and become president with a real mandate this time. But by now, his party was desperate for change. Ford didn't even compete against Reagan in the 1980 primaries. Nonetheless, Reagan offered him the VP slot on his ticket, a graceful olive branch for his former rival. But having been president once, Ford could not go back to being just the VP again. In the wake of Reagan's blowout victory, Ford faded from public imagination, a relic of a bygone, more complicated time. He had a pleasant retirement, playing golf and giving speeches, but turning down Reagan's VP pick was the last time he made any mark on history. Gerry Ford died on December 26, 2006 at the age of 93. He was buried in his beloved Grand Rapids. If Ford reflected on his legacy in his last few days, it's curious to wonder what he felt. To his credit, most today believe pardoning Nixon was the right move, helping to draw a line under a sordid episode in U.S. history. Ford's own character, too, helped restore some dignity to a White House that had been badly tarnished. But these are mostly abstract achievements, tiny stars amid a glowing constellation of indifference. Yet maybe that's the wrong way to look at things. Gerald Ford may have left a lot to be desired as a president, but it's worth remembering that the post is one he never sought. One he fell into by accident, like his SNL caricature plunging headfirst off a stage. For a former House Minority Speaker who should have faded into comfortable obscurity, the fact that we're talking about him at all is kind of an achievement. The fluke that made Ford president may have been a one-off, born of a strange era in American politics, but it does mean that history will now always remember Gerry Ford, the friendly, hard-working boy from Michigan who grew up to briefly lead the free world. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our friends Squarespace. There's a link below. And thank you for watching.